Hello and thanks for tuning in once again to DeHaan on Fire, a YouTube channel and podcast featuring commentary, education, and conversation with world-renowned fire investigator and forensic scientist Dr. John DeHaan. DeHaan on Fire is brought to you by Firewise Learning Academy. I'm your host, Tim Davis. In our questions for Dr. DeHaan today, we're going to talk about trace evidence and its part in the big picture when investigating a fire. DeHaan on Fire contains discussion and video not suitable for all audiences. Viewer and listener discretion is advised. And we're back again. Hello, Dr. DeHaan. Time for another question.
Good day. We'll try to be ready.
Fire investigators are looking at evidence, but there's this term trace evidence, which makes it seem like there's something unique about trace evidence. What is the difference between evidence and trace evidence, or what's peculiar about trace evidence?
Well, I guess the distinction is trace evidence is important information that requires some searching and consideration and sometimes specialized techniques, but most often the realization that there's a lot of hidden information in most scenes from technically the accelerant, if there's any accelerant that's been used to start the fire, that's considered trace evidence because it's not obvious. You have to search for it, and you have to find it and recover it and have it analyzed and things like that, to things like fingerprints and blood spatter, fibers, melted materials, glass, and even shoe prints and things like that a fire investigator may not consider, at first go. They're focused on the fire, and yeah, that's okay. But trace evidence is really what can give a thorough investigation context and sequence and connections that the general kind of fire evidence cannot.
Okay, so if I use a layman's term, if you're just focusing too much on the visible or the obvious evidence and not looking for those finer things, you can go down the wrong path.
Well, that's right. You're actually ignoring critical evidence that's going to help you reconstruct the event. And sometimes that trace evidence is your one clue to how the fire got started. It may be the residue of a first fuel, or the residue of an ignition mechanism, and you have to be aware of that, and be cognizant of the reality of that. I had one fire death case actually that a colleague of mine did, and the woman was found very badly burned in the kitchen, and her husband was asleep in the living room and awoke in the morning to find his wife dead of fire injuries in the adjoining kitchen. And of course they looked at him and said, well, you must have done this. And he said, no, both of us were drinking heavily, and I passed out hours ago and woke to find the fire self-extinguished and my wife dead of all these massive injuries. Well, the investigator was very cognizant of the role of trace evidence, and he realized that she was found adjacent to the kitchen stove. And the husband said, well, my wife was a cigarette smoker, and she was in the habit of, rather than trying to find a lighter, she'd go in the kitchen and lean over the stove and ignite her cigarette on the gas burner. And okay, that might explain how the fire got started, or the source of ignition, but what were the circumstances? Well, the investigator saw a tuft of charred material adhering to the burner, scraped it off, had the lab identify it, and it was her hair. And she had long hair, and what had happened apparently was she went to light a cigarette in her usual manner, and some of her hair, her long scalp hair, fell into the burner, ignited, and then she stood up in shock, inhaled the flames, and collapsed right at the foot of the counter. And then the counter caught fire from from the burning, hair and in clothing and things like that. And so it was completely accidental, but it would have been missed if he hadn't realized that that little tuft of charred material on the stove was actually the key to how the fire started.
So is it possible in a situation where you would pay too much attention to trace evidence that would become a distraction from things that were more obvious or apparent on the scene?
It's possible that you spend too much time, looking for the trace evidence that technically, that isn't there. It is time consuming to search for because it is small and easily overlooked. And it's usually compromised by the fire, at least changed in physical form and color and things like that by the fire. And if it hasn't been changed completely by the fire, certainly by the firefighters coming in and hosing the room down extensively with a water spray, that it's going to be altered or concealed to the point where it's simply not available. I mean, it is time consuming, but it can give answers that nothing else in the room can give a thorough investigation. And unfortunately, what's happened in the last 20 years or so is that the value of the DNA identification in physiological fluids, blood and saliva and things like that, has grown enormously over what it was 20 or 30 years ago, to the point where, well, all I have to do is go in and collect something with DNA on it, and that'll tell me, who this person is or who was here and things like that. Well, that's part of the puzzle that you're trying to recreate, but DNA isn't going to give you the context and sequence and the kind of identification of materials involved in your fire that real trace evidence is going to give you. I consider myself a trace evidence specialist, despite doing all these other analyses over the years. And when people would ask me, well, what's trace evidence? We'd kind of jokingly say, well, it's everything that doesn't bleed, shoot, or get you high. Oh, that covers a lot of ground, doesn't it? Well, yeah. And it's the glass and paint and fibers and hair and as I said, residues of first fuels and things like that are really critical to a proper investigation.
Well, that's a good reminder for investigators that when they're looking for the big picture, they've got to remember there's a lot of very small things that are part of it.
Well, that's right. I mean, in fact, I've got a good example here. If you have upholstered furniture as your first object that you think where the fire started, this looks a whole lot like this, and they're two different things. This is raw cotton. It still has some of the seeds and stuff like that in it, but this was the most common upholstery filler for decades, and it's literally described as cotton waste. It's not processed or anything like that, but it was cheap and durable enough that it would last. This, at first glance, looks the same, but it's polyester, and that's what's used in almost all modern furnishings and pillows and bed fillers and things like that. It's very light. It's cheap to make from a petroleum product base. It's got nice, crushability, and resilience, so it makes good padding for things. But what difference does this make to the fire investigator? Well, cotton waste can be easily ignited with a cigarette if it's buried deeply enough in the cotton waste. Can be ignited to a smolder with a cigarette in prolonged contact with it, and then the smolder can progress. You get a big enough lump of this stuff involved in the smoldering fire, it can transition to flame, and you're off to the races. The polyester does not smolder. You can put a cigarette in it and or other similar hot surface material, and it just melts and shrinks away from the heat source. This polyester, however, is very easily ignited by an open flame. So a candle or a lighter flame, or a burning ember from, say, a wildland fire or even a large fireplace fire can ignite this material, whereas the cotton waste is not readily ignitable by open flame. It tends to char on the surface and then self-extinguish.
Very interesting. Well, thank you for that answer, and we'll be back soon with another one.
All right. Thanks for asking.
We really appreciate you tuning in to watch these videos. Please, if you haven't subscribed already, please do so. Ring the bell for notifications, and don't forget to set your devices to receive those notifications, and you'll be alerted as soon as we upload new content to the channel. Until next time, for Dr. John DeHaan and Firewise Learning Academy, I'm Tim Davis, signing off. Goodbye.